The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the marble floor of our penthouse terrace as Marcus's voice carried through the sliding glass door. She's completely helpless without me, can't even balance a checkbook, let alone run a business. His business partner's laughter followed, sharp and cruel. Thank God for that prenup, right? When this marriage runs its course, she'll get nothing. Zero business acumen, zero assets, zero future. I stood frozen among the rose petals I'd scattered for our anniversary dinner, the Seattle skyline twinkling mockingly behind me as my world crumbled in real time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal shards reflected the city lights like fallen stars as I processed what I'd just heard. 3 years of marriage. And this was how my husband truly saw me, not as his partner, but as his burden. Not as someone capable of building anything meaningful, but as someone who would inevitably need rescuing. The man I'd supported through his real estate ventures, the man whose dreams I'd championed above my own, had just dismissed me as worthless in front of his most important business associate. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing for this evening. Our third wedding anniversary deserves something special, I'd thought. Something that would remind us both why we'd fallen in love. The private chef had left an hour ago, after preparing Marcus's favorite meal. The table on our terrace was set with our wedding china, candles flickering in the gentle evening breeze. I'd even worn the emerald dress he'd bought me for our honeymoon, the one he always said made my eyes sparkle. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was hiding behind our own door, eavesdropping on a conversation that would change everything. But there I was, pressed against the cool glass, listening to my husband and Jonathan Blackwell, the CEO of Pinnacle Holdings, discuss my inadequacies like I was some unfortunate business liability. The prenup was genius, Jonathan continued, his voice carrying that particular brand of arrogance that came with inherited wealth. Can you imagine if she had any claim to your portfolio? Thank God her father insisted on it. My stomach lurched. My father had insisted on the prenup, but Marcus had seemed hurt by it at the time. He'd made such a show of reluctantly agreeing, claiming he understood my family's concerns, but that it wounded him to think anyone doubted his love for me. Now I realized it had all been performance art. Elena's sweet, Marcus replied, and I could picture him swirling his whiskey the way he always did when he was feeling particularly satisfied with himself. But she's completely dependent. Can't make a decision without asking me first. Her father spoiled her rotten, never taught her anything practical. She's basically an expensive pet who looks good at charity galas. The casual cruelty of his words hit me like physical blows. An expensive pet. 3 years of what I thought was partnership, and he saw me as decorative livestock. What about that little consulting thing she keeps talking about? Jonathan asked, and I held my breath. For months, I'd been developing a business plan for a sustainable fashion consultancy. I'd shared my ideas with Marcus over dozens of dinners, seeking his input, excited about finally building something of my own. He'd seemed supportive, offering suggestions and encouragement. Marcus's laugh was dismissive. Oh, that. I humor her, let her play around with spreadsheets and mood boards. Keeps her busy while I handle the real business. She has no idea what it actually takes to build something from nothing. No understanding of cash flow, market analysis, competitive positioning. She thinks business is just having pretty ideas and hoping they work out. My hands clenched into fists. Those spreadsheets he dismissed had taken me months to perfect. The market analysis he claimed I couldn't understand had filled dozens of notebooks with research, demographic studies, and competitor assessments. The pretty ideas he mocked had been carefully researched solutions to real problems in the fashion industry's supply chain. Smart man, Jonathan said approvingly. Keep her dreams small and manageable. Women like that need to feel useful, but you can't actually let them think they're capable of real independence. Too dangerous. Exactly. I learned that from watching my father manage my mother. Give them enough rope to feel free, but never enough to actually hang themselves with it. Elena will always need me to take care of her, which means she'll never leave. Perfect setup. The calculating coldness in his voice made my skin crawl. This wasn't just dismissal. This was deliberate manipulation. He had been systematically undermining my confidence while pretending to support my dreams. Every time he'd suggested I might be taking on too much, every gentle redirection away from complex business concepts, every patient explanation of why I should let him handle the important decisions, it had all been orchestrated to keep me small. I thought about all the times I deferred to his expertise, convinced that his Harvard MBA and successful real estate portfolio meant he understood business in ways I never could. How many of my own instincts had I suppressed because Marcus had gently suggested I might be overthinking things? How many opportunities had I passed up because he'd convinced me I wasn't ready? Speaking of which, Jonathan continued, I have a proposition that might interest you. Pinnacle is looking to expand into the Pacific Northwest market. We need a local partner with solid connections and proven track record. Your Seattle portfolio speaks for itself. I'm listening, Marcus replied, and I could hear the excitement he was trying to suppress. $50 million development project. Luxury condominiums in Bellevue. We handle the financing and initial planning, you manage local permits and construction oversight. 60-40 split in your favor if you can close the deal within 90 days. $50 million. The number made my head spin. Marcus had never mentioned anything close to a project of this magnitude. Our conversations about his business ventures typically involved developments in the low millions, respectable but modest compared to what Jonathan was describing. Timeline's aggressive, Marcus mused, but doable. What's the catch? No catch, just discretion. This deal can't become public knowledge until all permits are secured. Too many moving parts. Too many people who'd want to interfere. Your wife, for instance. She can't know anything about this. Women talk, and their friends talk, and before you know it, the whole city knows your business. Elena won't be a problem, Marcus assured him. She doesn't understand business anyway, and she's too focused on her little hobby projects to pay attention to real deals. Hobby projects. My sustainable fashion consultancy, my carefully researched business plan, my dreams of creating something meaningful, all dismissed as hobby projects by the man who was supposed to be my partner in life. Good. Because this isn't just about money, Marcus. This is about building something that lasts. Real legacy wealth. The kind of generational foundation that sets your family up forever. Jonathan paused, and I heard the clink of glass against glass. To partnerships built on solid ground. To solid ground, Marcus echoed. As their conversation shifted to logistics and timelines, I remained frozen behind the glass door, processing the magnitude of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just about Marcus's low opinion of my capabilities. This was about a $50 million deal that could change everything, a deal he had no intention of sharing with me because he'd already decided I was too stupid to understand it. The champagne glass shards at my feet caught the light again, and I realized they looked like diamonds scattered across the marble. Diamonds that had been broken, just like my illusions about my marriage, but diamonds nonetheless. Beautiful even in their destruction. I stepped carefully around the glass and made my way silently to our home office, Marcus's voice fading behind me as he and Jonathan moved their conversation to the terrace. My hands were steady as I opened his laptop, grateful that he'd never bothered to change the password from our wedding date. If he thought so little of my intelligence, he probably assumed I'd never think to look. His email revealed a digital trail that confirmed everything I'd overheard and more. The Pinnacle Holdings correspondence went back months, detailing preliminary discussions about the Bellevue project. There were architectural renderings, zoning reports, financial projections, an entire secret business life that Marcus had hidden from me while dismissing my own entrepreneurial ambitions as childish fantasies. But what struck me most wasn't the deception itself. It was the casual arrogance in his communications with Jonathan. Messages where he referred to me as his little homebody and joked about keeping me busy with safe projects. Emails where he'd shared details about my business plans, not seeking advice for how to help me succeed, but asking for Jonathan's opinion on how long to let me play entrepreneur before steering me towards something more appropriate. The most damning email was from just 2 weeks ago. Marcus had forwarded Jonathan my complete business plan for the sustainable fashion consultancy, along with a message that made my blood run cold. Elena's latest passion project. Actually not terrible for amateur hour, but obviously not something that could work in the real world. Thinking of introducing her to some interior design contacts instead, more suitable for someone with her limitations. He had stolen my work, shared it without permission, and used it as entertainment for his business associate. Then he'd planned to redirect me toward interior design because he'd decided it was more suitable for someone with my limitations. I sat back in the leather chair that Marcus had chosen for his office, overwhelmed by the scope of his betrayal. This went beyond dismissive comments made in private. This was systematic undermining disguised as protection, calculated manipulation dressed up as love. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Caroline. "How's the anniversary dinner going? Did he love the surprise?" I'd told her about my plans for the evening, the special meal, the romantic setup on the terrace. She'd been so excited for me, convinced that Marcus would be touched by the effort I'd put into celebrating our marriage. I stared at her message, wondering how to respond. How do you tell someone that the romantic anniversary dinner you'd planned had turned into the moment your marriage revealed itself to be a lie? How do you explain that the man you thought supported your dreams had been actively sabotaging them? Instead of responding, I closed the phone and returned to Marcus's laptop. If he thought I was too stupid to understand business...
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I'd prove him wrong by understanding his business better than he realized I could. The Pinnacle Holdings folder contained hundreds of documents, but I began methodically working through them, taking screenshots and forwarding key files to my personal email account. The scope of the Bellevue project was even larger than what I'd overheard. This wasn't just a single development. It was phase one of a massive mixed-use complex that could eventually include retail, office space, and hospitality components. The total projected value over 5 years was close to $200 million. Marcus stood to make more money from this single deal than he'd earned in his entire career to date. And he'd planned to keep every detail secret from me, because he'd decided I was too intellectually limited to be trusted with real information. As I copied files and organized evidence, I heard their conversation continuing on the terrace. Jonathan was outlining the political connections that would be crucial for securing permits, while Marcus was detailing his relationships with local contractors and city planning officials. They spoke with the casual confidence of men who'd never had their competence questioned, who'd never been told their dreams were too big or their ideas too complicated for their capabilities. By the time I heard them wrapping up their discussion, I had accumulated a comprehensive understanding of the Pinnacle Holdings deal and Marcus's role in it. More importantly, I had documented proof of his deception and clear evidence of his true feelings about my potential for independence. I closed the laptop and returned to the terrace, just as Jonathan was gathering his things to leave. Marcus spotted me through the glass door and smiled, the same warm expression that had made me fall in love with him 4 years ago. Now it looked like a mask, carefully constructed to hide the contempt I'd heard in his voice just an hour earlier. "Elena, sweetheart," he called, sliding open the door. Perfect timing. Jonathan was just telling me what a lovely evening this is. Jonathan extended his hand with practiced charm. "Elena, you look radiant as always. Thank you for sharing your husband for a few minutes of business talk." I shook his hand and smiled politely, wondering if he could see the knowledge in my eyes. "Of course. I hope it was productive." "Very much so," Jonathan replied, glancing meaningfully at Marcus. "Your husband has some exciting opportunities ahead of him." "I'm sure he does," I said evenly. Marcus has always been very good at recognizing opportunities. After Jonathan left, Marcus turned to me with an expression of satisfied contentment. "Sorry about the interruption, love. You know how it is with business. Sometimes timing is everything." "I understand completely," I replied, and meant it more than he realized. He gestured toward the abandoned anniversary dinner setup, the candles now burned low and the food long cold. "Rain check on our celebration? This meeting was important, but tomorrow night, we can focus entirely on us." I nodded and began clearing the table, each movement careful and deliberate. Tomorrow night, I thought, I'll be focusing entirely on me. For the first time in 3 years, my future wouldn't be defined by what Marcus thought I could or couldn't accomplish. As I carried the dishes inside, my reflection caught in the glass door. The emerald dress still made my eyes sparkle, just as Marcus had always claimed. But now I recognized the light in them for what it really was. Not the sparkle of a pampered wife grateful for her husband's protection, but the gleam of a woman who'd just discovered exactly how much she was capable of accomplishing on her own. The broken champagne glass still lay scattered across the terrace floor, but I left it for morning. Some messes, I was learning, were worth cleaning up properly. Others were worth leaving as reminders of the moment everything changed. Later that night, as Marcus slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling and began planning. Not the gentle, tentative planning of a woman asking permission for her dreams, but the strategic, methodical planning of someone who just realized she'd been playing a game where only one person knew the real rules. If Marcus thought I'd never survive without him, I was about to prove him spectacularly wrong. And unlike his Bellevue development deal, my plans wouldn't need to be kept secret. Everyone would see exactly what Elena Martinez was capable of building when she stopped asking for permission and started taking action. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our penthouse as I sat at the kitchen island, nursing my third cup of coffee and watching Marcus move through his usual routine. He hummed while shaving, the same tune he'd hummed for 3 years, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman making his breakfast had spent the night planning her escape from their marriage. "You're up early," he observed, pecking my cheek as he reached for his coffee. "Couldn't sleep?" "Just thinking," I replied, not mentioning that my thoughts had crystallized into a detailed timeline for dismantling the life we'd built together. "About my consulting business." His smile was patronizing in a way I'd never noticed before last night. "Still working on that fashion thing? That's wonderful, sweetheart." Persistence is admirable. The dismissal was so casual, so automatic, that I wondered how many times he'd undermined my confidence without me realizing it. "Actually, I think I'm ready to take it more seriously. Maybe find an investor." Marcus paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "Investment?" "Elena, love, that's a big step. Are you sure you've thought this through? Running a real business isn't like organizing charity events." There it was again. The gentle suggestion that I was overreaching, packaged as caring concern. "What if I am ready? What if I've done more research than you realize?" He set down his cup and took my hands, his expression soft with what I now recognized as practiced manipulation. "Of course you have. You're incredibly thorough. But investment means other people's money, real accountability, serious consequences if things don't work out. Maybe we should start smaller. I could introduce you to some interior designers who might need consulting help." Interior design, exactly what he'd suggested to Jonathan in that email. I kept my expression neutral. "That's thoughtful, but I really think fashion is where my passion lies." "Passion is important," he agreed. "But so is being realistic about market conditions, startup costs, operational complexity." He squeezed my hands. "I just don't want to see you get hurt when reality doesn't match expectations." I nodded as if considering his wisdom, while mentally noting every word of his discouragement. "You're probably right. Maybe I should focus on smaller projects for now." Relief flickered across his face. "That's my smart girl. There's no rush, is there? We have everything we need." After he left for work, I allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of what I'd discovered. 3 years of being slowly, systematically convinced that my instincts were wrong, my ideas were naive, my capabilities were limited. 3 years of accepting smaller dreams because my husband had decided that was all I could handle. Then I got dressed, grabbed my laptop, and headed to a coffee shop across town where no one would recognize me. The barista was a young woman with purple hair and paint-stained fingers, probably an art student working part-time. She looked at me with the kind of direct assessment that came from someone used to evaluating people quickly. "First time here?" she asked, handing me my latte. "Yes. Looking for somewhere quiet to work." "Back corner booth is perfect for that. Privacy and good Wi-Fi." She paused, studying my face. "You okay? You look like someone who just made a big decision." I was surprised by her perceptiveness. "Something like that." "Well, whatever it is, good luck." Sometimes the biggest decisions are the hardest ones to make, but the most important ones to follow through on. Her words stayed with me as I settled into the corner booth and opened my laptop. The sustainable fashion consultancy business plan I'd spent months developing looked different now that I wasn't viewing it through the lens of Marcus's limitations. Without his voice in my head telling me to start smaller, think simpler, be more realistic, I could see what I'd actually created. It wasn't amateur hour, as he'd described it to Jonathan. It was comprehensive, well-researched, and addressed real problems in the fashion industry's supply chain. My proposed solution for connecting sustainable fabric suppliers directly with independent designers could disrupt the traditional wholesale model that favored large corporations over small businesses. The market analysis I'd dismissed as pretty ideas actually demonstrated a clear understanding of industry trends, consumer behavior, and competitive landscape. I had identified a gap in the market and developed a specific strategy for filling it. The financial projections were conservative, but showed strong potential for growth and profitability. Most importantly, I'd already begun building relationships with potential clients and suppliers without even realizing it. Through the charity work Marcus thought was just social networking, I'd met dozens of independent designers struggling to find sustainable materials at reasonable prices. Through my volunteer work with environmental organizations, I'd connected with textile manufacturers looking for new distribution channels. I wasn't starting from nothing, despite what Marcus believed. I was starting with a network, a plan, and a clear understanding of the market I wanted to enter. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. "How was the anniversary dinner? Marcus must have loved all your effort." I stared at her message, remembering how excited I'd been yesterday about surprising my husband. Now the memory felt like watching someone else's life, someone naive enough to believe that love meant accepting limitations. Instead of explaining everything in a text, I called her. "Elena, perfect timing. I'm between meetings but dying to hear about last night. Can you talk privately?" I asked. Something in my tone must have alerted her because her voice immediately shifted to concern. "Of course, what's wrong?" "I overheard Marcus talking about me last night, with a business associate. It wasn't good." Caroline was quiet for a moment. "How not good?" "He thinks I'm completely helpless. Called me an expensive pet who looks good at charity galas. Said I have no business acumen and would never survive without him taking care of me." "Elena, no, he didn't actually say that. Word for word. Along with some other things about keeping my dreams small and manageable so I never get ideas about real independence." I could hear Caroline taking a deep breath. "I'm coming over." "I'm not at home. I'm at a coffee shop, working on my business plan." "Good. That's exactly where you should be." Her voice was fierce now. "You know what? I never liked how he talked about your consulting idea. Always so supportive on the surface, but somehow you always walked away feeling like maybe you weren't ready for it. You noticed that?" "I noticed lots of things, like how you stopped talking about your own goals after you got married. How you started asking his permission for things you used to just do. How you stopped trusting your own judgment about business stuff, even though you have better instincts than most people I know." Her words hit me like physical relief. Someone else had seen what I'd been too close to recognize. "I found out about a business deal he's been hiding from me," I continued. $50 million. He's been planning it for months and never mentioned it because he decided I'm too stupid to understand real business. $50 million? Carolyn's voice went up an octave. "Elena, that changes everything. That's not just personal money, that's serious wealth. Life-changing wealth. That he planned to keep entirely to himself while convincing me that my little consulting business was too complicated for me to handle." "Okay," Caroline said, and I could hear her switching into lawyer mode. She was a corporate attorney for a tech startup, used to analyzing complex situations quickly. "First question, do you want to try to save the marriage, or are you done?" The question I'd been avoiding all morning. "I think I'm done. Not because of the money, but because of what it means about how he sees me. How he's always seen me. Then we plan accordingly. Second question, what do you need from me?" "I need to understand my legal position. The prenup, the business deal, what I'm entitled to and what I'm not. I'll connect you with someone who specializes in divorce law, but I can tell you the basics now. The prenup protects assets you each brought into the marriage, but anything earned during the marriage is typically community property. A $50 million business deal definitely qualifies." "Even if he kept it secret?" "Especially if he kept it secret. Hiding marital assets is a big problem for him, not for you." We talked for another hour, Caroline helping me think through practical next steps while I organized my thoughts on paper. By the time we hung up, I had the beginning of a real plan. Step 1 was information gathering. I needed to understand the full scope of Marcus's business activities, not just the Pinnacle Holdings deal. If he'd hidden one major opportunity from me, there might be others. Step 2 was financial independence. I couldn't leave the marriage if I didn't have my own resources. The prenup meant I wouldn't have access to Marcus's premarital assets, but I could start building my own income stream immediately. Step 3 was legal protection. Caroline was right that hiding marital assets was a serious issue, but I needed documentation to prove it. Step 4 was building my business while building my case. If Marcus thought I couldn't survive without him, the best response was to prove him wrong by thriving independently. I spent the rest of the day at the coffee shop, diving deeper into my business plan and researching the practical steps for launching a consulting firm. By evening, I had identified 3 potential clients who'd expressed interest in sustainable sourcing solutions, located 2 fabric suppliers who wanted better access to designer markets, and drafted a service proposal that could generate income within 30 days. The purple-haired barista stopped by my table as I was packing up. Productive day? Very. Thank you for the booth recommendation. No problem. You look different than when you came in this morning. More determined. I feel different. Good? Different? I considered the question. 12 hours ago, I'd been a woman whose husband thought she was helpless. Now I was a woman planning to prove him spectacularly wrong. Very good different. When I arrived home, Marcus was already there, reading financial reports in his office. The same office where I'd discovered his betrayal the night before. How was your day? He asked, not looking up from his papers. Productive. I worked on my business plan. That's nice, sweetheart. Keeping busy is important. Keeping busy. As if my professional ambitions were equivalent to a hobby meant to fill empty hours. I think I'm ready to start reaching out to potential clients. Now he looked up and I saw the flicker of concern he tried to hide. Clients? Elena, that's a big step. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of commitment? What kind of commitment do you think it involves? Well, client management is complicated. There are contracts, liability issues, payment terms, delivery schedules. It's not just about having good ideas. You have to execute consistently, handle difficult personalities, manage cash flow. He set down his papers and gave me his full attention. I'm not saying you can't do it eventually, but maybe we should talk through the practical aspects first. Every word was designed to make me doubt myself, to convince me I was attempting something beyond my capabilities. A day ago, it would have worked. Today, I recognized it for what it was. You're probably right, I said. Maybe I should start even smaller, just some informal consulting for friends. Relief relaxed his shoulders. That's perfect. Low stakes, good practice, chance to learn without pressure. I smiled and kissed his cheek. Thank you for looking out for me. That night, I lay awake planning while Marcus slept peacefully beside me. He thought he'd successfully redirected my ambitions towards something harmless and manageable. He had no idea that I was already 3 steps ahead of him. The next morning, I called the first designer on my potential client list. Miranda Chen Design, answered a crisp, professional voice. Hi, this is Elena Martinez. We met at the Sustainability Summit last month. You mentioned challenges finding reliable sources for organic cotton. Elena, yes, I remember. You had some interesting ideas about supply chain optimization. I've been developing those ideas into a formal consulting service. Would you be interested in discussing a pilot project? Silence for a moment, then excitement. Actually, yes. I just lost my main supplier and I'm scrambling to find alternatives for a collection that launches in 6 weeks. What did you have in mind? 2 hours later, I had my first client. Miranda needed 3 specific types of sustainable fabrics sourced within 4 weeks, and she was willing to pay a consulting fee, plus percentage of cost savings for successful delivery. It wasn't a huge contract, but it was real money for real work solving a real problem. I called the second designer on my list. Jackson Studios. Hi, this is Elena Martinez. We discussed sustainable sourcing at the Green Fashion Forum last month. Elena, perfect timing. I was just dealing with a supplier issue this morning. By noon, I had 2 clients and 1 serious prospect. By evening, I'd connected with 3 fabric suppliers who were excited about expanding their designer networks. Within 48 hours of overhearing Marcus dismiss my capabilities, I had the foundation of an actual business. The work was harder than I'd anticipated, but in all the best ways. Coordinating between designers and suppliers required juggling multiple conversations, negotiating prices, managing timelines, and solving problems I hadn't foreseen. Every challenge Marcus had warned me about was real, but so was my ability to handle them. When Miranda's organic cotton order arrived exactly on schedule and 15% under her previous supplier's pricing, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of professional competence. This wasn't Marcus being proud of me for organizing a successful charity event. This was me succeeding at something purely through my own knowledge and effort. "The cotton is perfect," Miranda told me over the phone. "Better quality than my old supplier and faster delivery. I have 3 other designers asking who I'm working with now." "I'd be happy to take on additional clients," I replied, already mentally scaling my operations. That weekend, Marcus asked about my consulting work with the casual interest he might show in a neighbor's garden. "How's the little fashion thing going?" "Well," I said truthfully, "I'm learning a lot." "Good. Learning is the important part. No pressure to turn it into anything big." If only he knew that his definition of anything big was becoming smaller by the day, while my actual ambitions were expanding beyond anything he'd thought to warn me against. 3 weeks into my new business, I was working 12-hour days and loving every minute of it. My client list had grown to 8 designers across 3 cities. My supplier network included firms in 4 countries. And my monthly revenue was approaching what Marcus made from a single small real estate deal. More importantly, I was building something entirely my own. Every client relationship, every successful sourcing solution, every problem solved through my own initiative added to my confidence in ways I hadn't experienced since before my marriage. The woman who'd believed she needed her husband's guidance to navigate the complexity of business was discovering that she'd actually been navigating complexity all along. Managing household budgets, coordinating charity events, researching investment options for our personal finances. All of it had been business skills disguised as domestic responsibilities. Marcus had convinced me that real business was some mysterious realm, requiring special knowledge and credentials I didn't possess. But real business, I was learning, was mostly about solving problems for people, and doing it consistently well. Everything else could be learned. 1 month after the anniversary dinner that changed everything, I was managing 15 active clients, had hired my first subcontractor to handle logistics, and was researching office space for what was rapidly outgrowing our home's spare bedroom. I still hadn't told Marcus about the scope of what I was building. He thought I was dabbling in informal consulting for friends, and I saw no reason to correct his assumptions. Let him think I was playing at business while I built something real. The irony was that his systematic undermining of my confidence had actually prepared me for independent success. Years of having my judgment questioned had taught me to research thoroughly before making decisions. Years of being told I was overthinking had taught me to analyze problems from multiple angles. Years of being encouraged to stay small had taught me the value of careful, methodical growth. Marcus thought he'd been protecting me from failure, but he'd actually been training me for the kind of strategic thinking that separated successful entrepreneurs from dreamers. My phone rang as I was reviewing contract terms for a new client, a sustainable jewelry designer in Portland who wanted help sourcing ethically mined gemstones. "Elena Martinez Consulting," I answered, still thrilling at the sound of my business name spoken aloud. "Is this Elena Martinez?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Yes. How can I help you?" "My name is Sophia Reeves. I'm the head of procurement for Sustainable Style Collective. We're a retail group focused on environmentally responsible fashion. One of our designers, Miranda Chen, recommended your services very highly. Sustainable Style Collective." I knew the name. They were one of the fastest-growing sustainable fashion retailers in North America, with stores in 12 major cities and an online presence that reached international markets. "Miranda is wonderful to work with," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite my racing pulse. "What kind of sourcing support are you looking for?" We're expanding our private label offerings and need a partner who can help us develop supply chains for organic and recycled materials at scale. Miranda said you've been sourcing exceptional quality at competitive prices. At scale. This wasn't about helping individual designers source materials for small collections. This was about potentially supplying materials for a major retailer's entire private label line. I'd be very interested in discussing your needs, I said. Could we schedule a call to review your specific requirements? Actually, I'm going to be in Seattle next week for meetings with another potential partner. Would you be available to meet in person? I prefer face-to-face conversations for partnerships of this magnitude. Partnerships of this magnitude. The phrase sent adrenaline coursing through my system. Absolutely, I'm available whenever works for your schedule. We arranged to meet the following Tuesday at her hotel. After hanging up, I sat staring at my phone, processing what had just happened. 1 month ago, Marcus had been explaining to Jonathan why I could never understand real business. Now I was being courted by a major retailer as a potential strategic partner. But the real revelation wasn't about the business opportunity itself. It was about realizing that I'd been approaching everything backwards. I'd been asking Marcus for permission to pursue my dreams, when what I should have been doing was pursuing my dreams and letting them speak for themselves. The woman he'd married had been seeking validation for her ambitions. The woman I was becoming was creating validation through her achievements. That evening, Marcus asked his usual questions about my day with his usual patronizing interest. How was the consulting work today? Productive, I replied. I'm meeting with a potential new client next week. That's wonderful. Another friend looking for sourcing help? Something like that. He smiled approvingly. It's nice that you're helping people. Very thoughtful of you to use your connections that way. Helping people. Using my connections. He still couldn't conceive of what I was doing as actual business, despite the fact that my monthly revenue was now larger than many of his smaller real estate deals. I wondered what he'd think if he knew that the little fashion thing he'd been humoring was on the verge of becoming something he'd have to take seriously. Then I realized I didn't actually care what he'd think. His opinion of my capabilities had become irrelevant to my success. The meeting with Sophia Reeves was scheduled for 10 a.m. on Tuesday at the Four Seasons downtown. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a navy suit I'd bought specifically for client meetings, carrying a leather portfolio containing detailed information about my sourcing network and case studies from successful projects. Sophia was a woman in her early 40s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. We shook hands in the hotel lobby and moved to a quiet corner of the restaurant. Miranda spoke very highly of your work, she began without preamble. She said you solved a sourcing crisis for her in record time and saved her 15% on material costs. Miranda had a clear understanding of her requirements, which made it easier to identify the right suppliers for her needs. Tell me about your background. How did you get into sustainable sourcing? I'd prepared for this question, but sitting across from someone who could potentially transform my small consulting business into something much larger, I felt the weight of the moment. I started in the nonprofit sector, working with environmental organizations on supply chain transparency issues. I noticed that many designers wanted to source sustainably, but couldn't access the supplier networks or pricing that larger companies took for granted. My consulting business focuses on democratizing access to sustainable materials. It was the truth, but framed in a way that emphasized my expertise rather than the fact that I'd started the business 1 month ago to prove my husband wrong about my capabilities. What's your capacity for scaling operations? That depends on the scope of what you're considering. Sophia opened her own portfolio and slid a document across the table. We're looking at launching a private label line focused on essentials, basic tops, bottoms, dresses, accessories, sustainable materials throughout, competitive pricing, broad market appeal. Initial order volume would be significant. I scanned the numbers on the page and kept my expression neutral despite my internal shock. Significant was an understatement. The projected order volumes for the first year alone represented more business than my current client base generated in 6 months. This would require establishing dedicated supplier relationships and potentially coordinating production across multiple facilities, I observed. Exactly. We're not looking for someone who can handle small orders when convenient. We need a partner who can commit to managing complex supply chains reliably over time. Complex supply chains. Reliable management over time. A month ago, Marcus had been convinced I couldn't handle the complexity of basic client relations. I'd need to review this in detail and provide you with a comprehensive proposal, I said. But based on what you're describing, I believe I can develop the supplier network and operational structure you're looking for. What's your timeline for getting back to me? 2 weeks. I want to make sure any proposal I present is thoroughly researched and realistically executable. Sophia smiled for the first time since we'd started talking. I appreciate careful planning. Too many people promise what they think I want to hear instead of what they can actually deliver. We spent another hour discussing technical requirements, quality standards, and logistics considerations. By the time we shook hands goodbye, I had a clear understanding of what would be required to win the contract, and a realistic assessment of my ability to deliver. The proposal would require expanding my supplier network significantly, establishing quality control processes I'd only read about, and developing operational systems that could handle volume orders without compromising the personal service that had attracted my initial clients. It was ambitious to the point of being intimidating. It was also exactly the kind of challenge that made me understand why Marcus had been wrong about my capabilities. I spent the rest of the week researching, planning, and modeling different approaches to scaling operations. The work was harder than anything I'd attempted, but it was also the most engaging professional challenge I'd ever encountered. Late Thursday night, I was still at the kitchen table surrounded by spreadsheets and supplier catalogs when Marcus came home from what he'd described as a business dinner. "You're up late," he observed, loosening his tie. "Still working on the consulting thing?" "Just finishing up some research." He glanced at the papers spread across the table but didn't seem to register their significance. Financial projections, operational flowcharts, supplier capacity analyses. To him, it probably looked like elaborate hobby materials. "Don't burn yourself out," he said, kissing the top of my head. "It's supposed to be fun, not stressful." Fun. As if building something meaningful could be reduced to entertainment value. After he went to bed, I continued working until nearly 2 a.m., driven by an energy I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about proving Marcus wrong anymore. This was about discovering what I was capable of when I stopped accepting limitations and started setting my own standards for success. By the time I submitted my proposal to Sophia Reeves, I knew I'd created something exceptional. Not just a plan for fulfilling their sourcing requirements, but a comprehensive strategy for revolutionizing how sustainable materials moved from producers to designers to consumers. The proposal included partnerships with certified organic cotton farms in 3 countries, arrangements with innovative recycling facilities that could convert textile waste into new materials, and a quality control system that would ensure consistency across all supplier relationships. More importantly, it included a vision for how sustainable sourcing could become the industry standard rather than the premium option, through economies of scale and strategic partnerships that made environmental responsibility economically advantageous. 3 days after submitting the proposal, Sophia called. "Elena, I've reviewed your submission with our executive team. This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we were hoping to find." I gripped the phone tighter. "I'm glad it meets your expectations." "It exceeds them. We'd like to move forward with a pilot program. 6 months. Limited product line. Chance for both of us to test operational compatibility before committing to the full partnership." 6 months. Pilot program. The words that would transform my month-old consulting business into something that required serious infrastructure, dedicated staff, and operational complexity that Marcus would no longer be able to dismiss as, quote, keeping busy. "I'd be very interested in discussing terms," I managed. "Good. Can you be in San Francisco next week? I'd like you to meet the rest of the procurement team and tour our main distribution facility." San Francisco. Meeting the procurement team. Touring distribution facilities. This was no longer about helping individual designers source materials. This was about becoming an integral part of a major retailer's supply chain strategy. After we scheduled the trip, I sat in my home office, the spare bedroom that had become the headquarters of Elena Martinez Consulting, and tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. 6 weeks ago, I'd been a woman whose husband thought she was too helpless to survive independently. Now I was being flown to California to finalize a partnership that could generate more revenue in a year than Marcus made from most of his real estate deals. The transformation had happened so quickly that I almost felt disconnected from it, as if I were watching someone else's success story unfold. But the satisfaction was entirely my own, built through my own decisions and executed through my own competence. I thought about calling Caroline to share the news, then decided to wait until after the San Francisco trip. I wanted to have the signed contract in hand before celebrating, wanted the success to be completely solid before making it real to anyone else. Instead, I opened a new document on my laptop and began planning the next phase of expansion. If the sustainable style collective partnership went forward as planned, I'd need to hire additional staff, lease proper office space, and develop systems that could handle operations at a scale I'd never imagined possible. The woman who'd needed Marcus's permission to pursue business ambitions was designing organizational structures for managing international supply chains. The transformation was so complete that I barely recognized my former self. That night at dinner, Marcus asked about my upcoming travel plans. "I have a business trip next week," I mentioned casually. "Business trip? Where to?" "San Francisco, meeting with a potential client." "San Francisco?" His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "That seems like a lot of effort for consulting work." "They're based there. It's easier to meet in person for certain kinds of discussions." He frowned slightly. "Elena, I hope you're not getting in over your head. Business travel can be complicated, especially when you're dealing with people you don't know well." There it was again, the gentle suggestion that I was attempting something beyond my capabilities, packaged as protective concern. "I'm sure it will be fine," I replied. "Just a day trip. Still, maybe I should look into this company first. Make sure they're legitimate. You know how these things can go." As if I were a child considering a suspicious business opportunity rather than an experienced consultant being courted by a major retailer. "That's thoughtful, but I've already researched them thoroughly. They're well established in the industry." "Of course, but sometimes these smaller companies can be misleading about their actual size and capabilities. I don't want you to get disappointed if it doesn't turn out to be what you're expecting." Smaller companies. He assumed that anyone interested in working with me must be operating at a scale that matched his assessment of my limitations. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I'm confident about the opportunity." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I just want to make sure you don't get hurt. Business can be ruthless, especially for people who haven't been exposed to that world." As if the months I'd spent building client relationships, negotiating contracts, and managing complex logistics had been some kind of elaborate game, rather than actual business experience. "I understand," I replied, while mentally noting that his definition of protection looked remarkably similar to sabotage. That night, I lay awake thinking about the strange parallel tracks my life had developed. During the day, I was building something significant and challenging, solving problems that required real expertise and strategic thinking. During the evening, I was listening to my husband explain why I wasn't capable of the work I'd been successfully doing for weeks. It was like living in two different realities simultaneously. In one, I was Elena Martinez, successful consultant on the verge of a major partnership. In the other, I was Elena Martinez, helpless wife who needed protection from her own ambitions. The disconnect was so complete that I wondered how I'd maintained both versions for so long. How had I spent years accepting Marcus's assessment of my limitations, while also managing complex projects and making strategic decisions in other areas of my life? The answer, I realized, was that I'd been compartmentalizing my competence. Business skills demonstrated in charity work or household management didn't count as real business skills, because Marcus had convinced me that real business was something different. Something more complicated, something I couldn't understand without his guidance. But there was no meaningful difference between coordinating a charity fundraiser that raised $200,000 and coordinating a supply chain that delivered materials worth the same amount. The skills were identical, only the context was different. Marcus had convinced me to discount my own experience by creating artificial distinctions between types of work. Nonprofit work was helping people, not real business. Household financial management was domestic responsibility, not financial planning. Event coordination was social networking, not project management. Every professional skill I'd demonstrated had been reframed as something other than professional competence, leaving me convinced that I lacked the capabilities I'd been using successfully for years. The revelation was both liberating and infuriating. Liberating because it meant I'd been ready for independent success long before I realized it. Infuriating because it meant Marcus had been systematically undermining my confidence in abilities I'd been demonstrating all along. But anger, I was learning, could be remarkably productive when channeled into proving someone wrong through concrete achievement rather than argument. The San Francisco trip would be my opportunity to transform potential into reality, to sign the contract that would make my success impossible for anyone to dismiss or minimize, including myself. The Sustainable Style Collective headquarters occupied an entire floor of a gleaming tower in San Francisco's financial district, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the bay. As the elevator doors opened on the 23rd floor, I stepped into a reception area that screamed success. Polished concrete floors, living walls of greenery, and the kind of modern furniture that looked like art installations. Elena Martinez to see Sophia Reeves, I told the receptionist, a young man with perfectly styled hair and the kind of effortless confidence that came from working for a company everyone wanted to be associated with. Ms. Reeves is expecting you, he replied, gesturing toward a corridor lined with photographs of models wearing flowing, earth-toned clothing against backdrops of organic farms and recycling facilities. Conference Room 3, just past the design studio. I walked through their workspace, observing the controlled chaos of a successful creative business. Designers hunched over sketch pads, fabric samples covered every available surface, and the walls were covered with mood boards tracking seasonal trends and sustainability innovations. This wasn't just a fashion company. It was a laboratory for reimagining how clothing could be produced and consumed responsibly. The conference room contained 8 people around a sleek table, all of whom looked up as I entered. Sophia rose to greet me, but my attention was immediately captured by the woman sitting at the head of the table. Silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, wearing a deceptively simple black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Elena, thank you for making the trip, Sophia said, guiding me around the table. I'd like you to meet Victoria Chen, our CEO and founder. Victoria Chen. I recognized the name from business magazines and sustainability conferences. She'd built Sustainable Style Collective from a single boutique in Berkeley into a retail empire that had revolutionized how consumers thought about ethical fashion. She was also, I realized with a start, Miranda's mother. Ms. Martinez, Victoria said, extending her hand with a grip that was both warm and evaluative. My daughter speaks very highly of your work. She says you solved a sourcing problem for her that 3 other consultants couldn't handle. Miranda makes my job easy by being very specific about her requirements, I replied, accepting the compliment while deflecting it appropriately. Clear communication always leads to better outcomes. Victoria smiled approvingly. Spoken like someone who understands that successful partnerships are built on realistic expectations rather than impressive promises. The introductions continued around the table. Procurement managers, operations directors, sustainability coordinators, financial analysts. Each person represented a different aspect of the business I'd be working with if the partnership moved forward. More importantly, each person's questions during the presentation would test different aspects of my expertise and preparation. Sophia gestured for me to take the seat at the opposite end of the table from Victoria, positioning me as an equal participant rather than a vendor making a pitch. The subtle gesture suggested that they were already thinking of me as a potential partner rather than a service provider. Before we dive into your proposal, Victoria began, I'd like to understand your philosophy about sustainable sourcing. We've worked with consultants who see it as a marketing angle, and consultants who see it as a cost center. What do you see it as? The question was clearly a test, designed to reveal whether I understood sustainability as a core business strategy, or just a trendy add-on. I'd anticipated this type of philosophical inquiry and prepared my response carefully. I see sustainable sourcing as a competitive advantage that becomes more valuable over time, I replied. Right now, it differentiates brands and appeals to conscious consumers, but environmental regulations are tightening. Resource scarcity is increasing costs for traditional materials, and supply chain transparency is becoming legally required in more markets. Companies that build sustainable sourcing capabilities now will have operational advantages later, when it becomes mandatory rather than optional. Victoria nodded thoughtfully. So you see sustainability as inevitable rather than idealistic. I see it as smart business disguised as idealism. The companies that figure out how to make sustainable practices profitable will dominate their industries within the next decade. The procurement manager, a woman named Janet with short gray hair and the demeanor of someone used to cutting through corporate nonsense, leaned forward. Your proposal mentions partnerships with organic cotton farms in 3 countries. How do you ensure consistent quality across different agricultural systems and climate conditions? The question demonstrated that they'd read my proposal thoroughly and were testing my practical knowledge rather than just my strategic thinking. This was where my months of research and relationship building would either prove sufficient or reveal gaps in my expertise. Quality consistency in organic cotton requires understanding the specific growing conditions and processing methods in each region, I began, pulling up detailed notes on my tablet. In Peru, the coastal climate allows for year-round growing, but requires careful irrigation management. In Turkey, the Mediterranean climate produces excellent fiber quality, but seasonal variations affect harvest timing. In India, monsoon patterns impact both quality and quantity, so contracts need flexibility clauses for weather-related delays. I continued for 10 minutes, detailing specific quality control measures, testing protocols, and relationship management strategies for each supplier region. Janet asked increasingly technical questions about fiber length specifications, chemical residue testing, and transportation logistics. Each answer revealed another layer of the operational complexity I'd spent weeks mastering. The financial analyst, a young man who looked like he'd stepped out of a business school recruiting brochure, raised his hand. Your pricing models show cost savings compared to current market rates. How sustainable are those savings if demand increases significantly? Another excellent question that tested whether I understood supply and demand dynamics or had simply offered attractive numbers without considering scalability. The cost savings come from 3 sources, I explained, switching to a different section of my presentation. First, direct relationships with producers eliminate middleman markups that can add 15 to 20% to material costs. Second, longer-term contracts allow farmers to plan production more efficiently, which reduces their costs and gets passed along as price stability. Third, coordinated purchasing across multiple designers creates volume discounts that individual buyers can't access. I walked them through specific examples of how these dynamics had played out with my existing clients, showing real numbers from completed transactions rather than theoretical projections. However, I continued, you're right that increased demand would eventually impact pricing. My proposal includes a scaling strategy that expands supplier relationships proportionally to maintain competitive rates as volume grows. The questions continued for 2 hours, each one revealing another aspect of the business I needed to understand thoroughly. Supply chain risk management, international trade regulations, quality control systems, inventory planning, currency hedging, sustainable packaging, carbon footprint calculations, social impact measurement. By the time the formal presentation ended, I felt like I'd just completed the most comprehensive business examination of my life. Every month of research, every client relationship, every problem I'd solved had prepared me for different aspects of their evaluation. Thank you, Elena, Victoria said as I finished answering the final question about worker safety standards in textile facilities. This has been exactly the kind of detailed discussion we hoped to have. Sophia walked me to a smaller conference room where we could speak privately about next steps. Through the windows, I could see the Golden Gate Bridge emerging from the afternoon fog, and for a moment I allowed myself to imagine what it would feel like to have meetings in rooms like this regularly. That went well, Sophia observed, settling into one of the leather chairs. Victoria doesn't usually spend 2 hours with potential partners unless she's seriously interested. The questions were thorough, I replied diplomatically. Your team clearly knows what they're looking for. They also know when someone has done their homework versus when someone is improvising impressive-sounding answers. You demonstrated real expertise, not just enthusiasm, real expertise. The phrase resonated because it represented something Marcus had never acknowledged I possessed, despite months of evidence to the contrary. "What are the next steps?" I asked. "Victoria wants to move forward with the pilot program. 6 months, limited product line, chance for both sides to test compatibility before committing to the full partnership." Sophia opened a folder and slid a document across the table. "This is our initial contract offer." I scanned the terms quickly, noting the scope of work, payment schedules, performance metrics, and expansion clauses. The financial terms were more generous than I'd hoped, reflecting the value they placed on securing a reliable sourcing partner. More importantly, the contract included provisions for scaling operations if the pilot program succeeded, with built-in growth targets that would require me to expand significantly over the next 2 years. "This looks fair," I said, though I had no intention of signing anything without thorough legal review. "I'll need a few days to review the details with my attorney." "Of course. We're not looking for a quick decision. We're looking for a thoughtful partnership." As I prepared to leave, Sophia asked a question that caught me off guard. "Can I ask what motivated you to start your consulting business? Your background suggests you could have taken a more traditional corporate path." I paused, considering how much of the truth to reveal. The real answer, that I'd started my business to prove my husband wrong about my capabilities, wasn't exactly professional motivation. "I saw a gap in the market," I replied carefully. "Designers who wanted to source sustainably, but couldn't access the supplier networks or expertise that larger companies take for granted. It seemed like an opportunity to democratize access to responsible materials." Sophia nodded approvingly. "Personal motivation often drives the best business solutions. When someone starts a business to solve a problem they've experienced themselves, they tend to understand the market more intuitively." Flying back to Seattle that evening, I reviewed the contract offer and tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. 6 months ago, I'd been a woman whose husband thought she couldn't handle the complexity of running a business. Now I was negotiating a partnership that would require managing international supply chains, coordinating production across multiple countries, and delivering materials for a major retailer's private label line. The transformation had happened so quickly that I sometimes felt disconnected from it, as if I were watching someone else's success story unfold. But the satisfaction was entirely my own, built through my own decisions and executed through my own competence. I thought about Marcus, probably at home reviewing his own business documents, completely unaware that his wife was returning from a meeting that could change everything about their financial future. He'd ask about my day with his usual patronizing interest, and I'd give him the same vague answers I'd been providing for weeks. The secret felt powerful now rather than deceptive. I wasn't hiding my success out of fear or uncertainty. I was protecting it until it became too large to dismiss or minimize. The plane descended through the clouds toward Seattle, and I could see the city lights spreading toward the mountains. Somewhere down there was the penthouse, where Marcus was probably reviewing his Pinnacle Holdings documents, planning the $50 million deal he thought I was too stupid to understand. Soon, I thought, he'd discover that his wife had been building something he'd never thought to keep secret from her, because he'd never imagined she was capable of building anything worth hiding. Back home, Marcus was in his office with papers spread across the desk, exactly as I'd expected. He looked up as I entered, his expression the familiar combination of mild interest and gentle condescension. "How was San Francisco?" he asked. "Did your meeting go well?" "Very well. They're interested in moving forward." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm proud of you for following through on this project." Following through on this project. As if consistency, rather than competence, was the surprising achievement. "It might require some travel over the next few months," I mentioned. "Regular check-ins, relationship building." A flicker of concern crossed his face. "How much travel?" "Elena, I hope you're not letting them take advantage of your eagerness. Sometimes these smaller companies will ask for excessive availability because they can't afford to hire full-time staff." Smaller companies. Again, he assumed that anyone interested in working with me must be operating at a scale that matched his assessment of my limitations. "I think I can manage the schedule," I replied. "Of course you can. I just want to make sure you're setting appropriate boundaries. Business relationships can become complicated if you're too accommodating." Too accommodating. The irony was that I'd spent 3 years being too accommodating to him, Accepting his limitations on my ambitions, while he pursued opportunities he never bothered to discuss with me. "I'll be careful," I assured him. That weekend I met Carolyn for brunch at a small cafe near her office, finally ready to share the full scope of what I'd been building. She arrived wearing her weekend uniform of jeans and a cashmere sweater, looking every inch the successful attorney who'd learned to balance professional achievement with personal life. "You look different," she observed as we settled into a corner booth. "More? Confident? Energized?" "I have news," I said, unable to suppress my smile any longer. "Big news. About the consulting business?" "About the consulting business that's turning into something much larger than I expected." I told her everything. The client list that had grown to 23 designers across 8 cities, the supplier network that now included partners in 6 countries, the sustainable style collective meeting and contract offer that could transform my small consulting firm into a major player in sustainable sourcing. Caroline listened with increasing amazement, asking clarifying questions and taking notes as if she were analyzing a complex legal case. "Elena," she said when I finished, "this isn't a consulting business anymore. This is a legitimate company with serious growth potential. Do you realize what you've built?" "I'm starting to," I admitted. "It happened faster than I expected." "How much is the sustainable style contract worth annually?" I showed her the financial projections I'd developed, watching her eyes widen as she processed the numbers. "This is more than Marcus makes from most of his real estate deals," she said. "Elena, this changes everything about your financial position in the marriage." "I know. That's part of why I haven't told him yet." Carolyn set down her coffee cup and looked at me seriously. "What's your plan? Are you trying to save the marriage, or are you building independence?" The question I'd been avoiding for weeks, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "I think I'm building independence," I said. "Not just financial independence, but psychological independence. I need to know who I am when I'm not being managed by someone who thinks I'm incapable." "And what have you learned?" I considered the question, thinking about the months of challenges I'd navigated, problems I'd solved, relationships I'd built through my own competence and judgment. I've learned that Marcus was wrong about everything. My capabilities, my potential, my need for his protection and guidance. I've been managing complexity and making strategic decisions successfully for months. The only thing that was holding me back was believing his assessment of my limitations. Caroline nodded thoughtfully. "So the consulting business became a way of discovering what you could accomplish independently." "Exactly. And what I've discovered is that I don't need his permission for my ambitions or his validation for my achievements." "What happens when he finds out?" "I don't know yet, but I know I'm not going back to being the woman who asks her husband's permission to pursue her dreams." We spent the rest of brunch discussing practical matters: legal protection for my business assets, strategies for managing the transition if I decided to leave the marriage, ways to ensure my success remained mine regardless of what happened with Marcus. As we prepared to leave, Caroline asked one final question. "Are you happy? With what you're building, I mean." I thought about the satisfaction I felt when solving complex sourcing problems, the energy I brought to client relationships, the excitement of seeing my strategic plans executed successfully. "I'm happier than I've been in years," I replied. "I'm doing work that matters, building something meaningful, using capabilities I'd forgotten I had. For the first time since I got married, I feel like myself again." "Then whatever happens with Marcus, you've already succeeded." That night, I signed the Sustainable Style Collective contract after my attorney confirmed that the terms were fair and the growth projections realistic. The next morning, I hired my first full-time employee, a logistics coordinator who could manage the operational complexity of international sourcing while I focused on strategic planning and client relationships. 2 weeks later, I signed the lease on office space in a converted warehouse in Capitol Hill. A bright, open environment that felt like the kind of place where creative solutions to complex problems were not just possible but inevitable. The office signing required listing business references and providing financial documentation that revealed the scope of my operations. As I filled out the forms, I realized that Elena Martinez Consulting had become the kind of established business that could qualify for significant commercial leases based on revenue and growth projections. Marcus knew none of this because I'd stopped asking him to participate in my decision-making process. His approval was no longer relevant to my success, and his skepticism was no longer capable of undermining my confidence. The woman who'd needed her husband's permission to pursue business ambitions was designing operational systems for managing a company that employed multiple people and generated substantial monthly revenue. My first employee, Jessica, was a recent supply chain management graduate who brought organizational skills and technical knowledge that complemented my client relationship strengths. On her first day, she looked around our new office, brick walls, exposed beams, windows overlooking the city, and asked the question I'd been avoiding. "This is pretty impressive for a consulting business that started 6 months ago," she observed. "What's your 5-year plan?" 5-year plan. I had been so focused on immediate challenges and quarterly growth that I hadn't stepped back to consider the long-term trajectory of what I was building. "I think we're going to become the go-to sourcing partner for sustainable fashion companies across North America," I replied, surprising myself with the confidence in my voice. "Maybe internationally if the market develops the way I expect it to." "That's ambitious," Jessica said approvingly. "But based on what you've accomplished so far, it seems realistic." Realistic. The word that Marcus had used to discourage my ambitions was now being used to validate them by someone who understood the industry and had evaluated my track record objectively. That evening, I stood in our new office as the sun set over Elliott Bay, looking at the whiteboards covered with supplier networks, client timelines, and growth projections. 6 months ago, I'd been a woman whose husband thought she'd never survive without his guidance. Now I was running a business that required strategic thinking, operational expertise, and leadership skills I discovered I possessed. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. I moved differently, spoke with more authority, made decisions with greater confidence. I'd stopped second-guessing my instincts and started trusting my expertise. Most importantly, I'd stopped defining my potential through Marcus's expectations and started setting my own standards for success. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia Reeves. "First shipment from your Turkish suppliers exceeded quality expectations. Victoria wants to discuss expanding the pilot program ahead of schedule." Expanding the pilot program ahead of schedule. The success was happening faster than anyone had projected, including me. I texted back, "Happy to discuss expansion. When works for your schedule?" Her response came immediately. "Are you available for a call tonight? Victoria has some ideas she wants to run past you." As I prepared for a strategic planning call with the CEO of a major retail company, I thought about Marcus at home, probably reviewing his Pinnacle Holdings documents and congratulating himself on keeping complex business matters away from his wife who couldn't understand such things. Soon I realized I'd need to decide whether to keep protecting him from the reality of what I'd accomplished, or let him discover that the woman he'd systematically underestimated had built something more impressive than anything he'd imagined she was capable of creating. The call with Victoria lasted 2 hours, ending with an agreement to triple the scope of our partnership and expand into accessory sourcing within the next quarter. By the time I hung up, Elena Martinez Consulting had committed to managing supply chains that would generate more revenue in the next 12 months than Marcus typically earned in 3 years. Walking to my car in the empty parking lot, I realized I was no longer building a business to prove my husband wrong about my capabilities. I was building a business because I'd discovered I was exceptionally good at it, and because the work itself had become more engaging and satisfying than anything I'd done in my professional life. The woman who'd started consulting to demonstrate her competence had evolved into someone who no longer needed external validation for her achievements. My success had become self-sustaining, driven by my own standards rather than anyone else's expectations. Marcus had wanted to keep me small and manageable, convinced that my dependence on him was necessary for our marriage's stability. Instead, his systematic undermining had taught me to be completely self-reliant, strategically independent, and professionally successful beyond anything he'd thought to prepare for. Tomorrow, I'd wake up as the CEO of a rapidly growing company with international operations, significant revenue, and expansion opportunities that could reshape the sustainable fashion industry. Tonight, I'd go home to a husband who still thought I was playing at business, while he handled the real work of building wealth and security for our future. The irony was so complete that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The notification chimed on my phone as I was reviewing quarterly projections in my office, the morning light streaming through the large windows overlooking the Seattle waterfront. Elena Martinez Consulting had grown into Elena Martinez International, and the numbers on my screen reflected a transformation that even I sometimes struggled to believe. "Elena, your 10 o'clock is here," Jessica announced over the intercom system we'd installed when the team expanded to 12 employees. Thomas Mitchell from Pacific Trade Finance. Thomas Mitchell represented the kind of opportunity that would have terrified me 8 months ago but now felt like a natural progression. His company specialized in providing capital and credit facilities for businesses engaged in international trade, and our conversation today would determine whether Elena Martinez International could access the financial resources needed for the next phase of expansion. I straightened my blazer and walked to the conference room, where a man in his 50s with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone who'd spent decades evaluating business opportunities was reviewing documents from a leather portfolio. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for coming in," I said, extending my hand. "I appreciate you taking the time to learn about our operations." "Please, call me Tom," he replied, his handshake firm and evaluative. "I've been following your company's growth with considerable interest. 18 months from startup to international operations is impressive by any standard. 18 months. The timeline still amazed me when I heard it spoken aloud. Less than 2 years ago, I'd been a woman whose husband thought she couldn't balance a checkbook. Now I was meeting with financial institutions about credit facilities that would support multi-million-dollar international transactions. Growth has been faster than we initially projected, I admitted, settling into the chair across from him, which is why we need more sophisticated financial infrastructure to support continued expansion. Tom opened his portfolio and pulled out a detailed analysis that his team had prepared. "Your revenue growth is exceptional, but what really caught our attention is your client retention rate. 97% over the past 12 months suggests you're solving real problems rather than just filling a temporary need." "Our clients stay with us because we deliver consistent value," I replied. "Sustainable sourcing isn't just a trend anymore. It's becoming a business necessity. Companies that establish reliable supply chains now will have competitive advantages as environmental regulations tighten and consumer expectations evolve." "That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking we look for in potential partners," Tom said approvingly. "Let's talk about your expansion plans." I walked him through the comprehensive growth strategy that my team had developed over the past month. Phase 1 involved establishing permanent offices in Los Angeles and Portland to better serve West Coast clients. Phase 2 would add operations in Toronto and Vancouver to capture the Canadian sustainable fashion market. Phase 3 contemplated European expansion, starting with London and Amsterdam. Each phase required significant capital investment in office space, equipment, staff, and inventory management systems. More importantly, international operations would require credit facilities that could handle currency fluctuations, customs delays, and the complex payment schedules that characterized global supply chain management. "Your financial projections are conservative," Tom observed, reviewing the spreadsheets I'd provided. "Most companies in rapid expansion phase show more aggressive revenue forecasts. I prefer realistic projections that I can exceed, rather than optimistic ones that create pressure to cut corners," I replied. "Sustainable growth is more valuable than dramatic growth if you're building something meant to last." Tom made notes in the margins of his analysis. "What's your experience with international banking relationships, currency hedging, trade credit insurance?" "Limited direct experience, but I've been working with consultants who specialize in international trade finance to develop our systems and processes. I know what I don't know, and I'm committed to learning what I need to learn." The honesty seemed to impress him more than false expertise would have. Smart approach. Too many entrepreneurs think they can figure out complex financial instruments on the fly. "What kind of credit facility are you looking for?" We spent the next hour discussing technical details that would have been incomprehensible to me a year ago, but now felt like natural extensions of strategic planning I'd been doing for months. Lines of credit for inventory purchases, letters of credit for international suppliers, foreign exchange hedging to protect against currency fluctuations. "Based on your current operations and growth trajectory," Tom concluded, "I think we can structure a facility that gives you access to the capital you need while protecting both parties against the risks inherent in international trade." He outlined terms that were more favorable than I'd hoped, reflecting the strength of my business fundamentals and growth potential. The proposed credit facility would provide access to several $1 million in working capital, enough to fund the expansion phases I'd described, and position the company for even larger opportunities. I'll need a few days to review this with my attorney and accountant, I said, though I was already confident the terms were acceptable. Of course, this is exactly the kind of thoughtful approach that makes us comfortable working with growing businesses. After Tom left, I sat in my office looking at the term sheet he'd provided, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. A major financial institution was offering me access to millions of dollars in credit based on their assessment of my business acumen and growth potential. The woman Marcus had dismissed as incapable of understanding cash flow was now negotiating credit facilities that would support international expansion across multiple markets. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize with a New York area code. Elena Martinez International, this is Elena. Ms. Martinez, this is David Chen calling from Apex Ventures. We're a private equity firm focused on sustainable business models, and we've been tracking your company's growth with considerable interest. Private equity. I'd heard the term in business contexts, but never imagined it would apply to my company. What kind of interest? The kind that involves capital investment and strategic partnerships to accelerate growth beyond what traditional financing can support. Would you be available to discuss a potential investment opportunity? An hour later, I was on a conference call with David Chen and two of his colleagues, learning about investment structures I'd only read about in business magazines. Apex Ventures specialized in identifying rapidly growing companies in the sustainability sector and providing both capital and strategic guidance to help them scale more quickly. Your business model addresses a real inefficiency in the fashion supply chain, David explained. More importantly, you've demonstrated the operational competence to execute on growth opportunities. That combination is exactly what we look for in investment targets. Investment targets. The phrase suggested that Elena Martinez International had evolved beyond a consulting business or even a successful small company. We were now being evaluated as a potentially significant player in the sustainable fashion ecosystem. What would an investment relationship look like? I asked. Capital infusion to accelerate expansion, strategic guidance on market entry and operational scaling, introductions to potential clients and partners in our portfolio. In exchange, we'd acquire an equity stake that reflects our contribution to the company's growth. Equity stake. Sharing ownership of the business I'd built from nothing was a complex decision that would require careful consideration. But the conversation itself represented validation of what I'd accomplished that went beyond anything I could have imagined when I started. I'd need to understand the specific terms and structure, I said. This is my first experience with private equity investment. Completely understandable. Why don't we arrange an in-person meeting next week? I can fly out to Seattle, tour your operations, meet your team, and present our investment proposal in detail. After ending the call, I walked around my office trying to process the day's developments. A major financial institution was offering substantial credit facilities. A private equity firm was interested in making an investment that could accelerate expansion beyond anything I'd planned. Both conversations had treated me as an experienced business leader, whose judgment and strategic thinking were worthy of significant financial backing. The transformation was so complete that I sometimes felt disconnected from the woman who'd started this business to prove her husband wrong. That woman had been focused on demonstrating basic competence. The woman I'd become was being courted by sophisticated financial institutions based on demonstrated excellence. My assistant knocked on the door and entered with the afternoon's priority correspondence. Among the contracts, supplier agreements, and client communications was an envelope marked personal and confidential, with Marcus's law firm's return address. I opened it with curiosity rather than concern, assuming it was some routine matter related to our joint financial accounts or insurance policies. Instead, I found a letter that made my blood run cold. Dear Mrs. Hernandez, it began, using the formal address that Marcus's attorneys employed for official correspondence. We are writing to inform you of certain business developments that may affect your financial interests as the spouse of our client, Marcus Hernandez. The letter went on to explain that Marcus was entering into a significant business partnership that would require him to pledge certain marital assets as collateral. The Pinnacle Holdings development deal, which I'd discovered months ago through his email, was moving forward and required guarantees that included our house, investment accounts, and other jointly held property. While the prenuptial agreement limits your claims to premarital assets, the letter continued. Washington state law requires spousal consent for pledging marital residence and joint accounts as business collateral. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to schedule an appointment for document signing. I read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of audacity. Marcus hadn't mentioned the Pinnacle Holdings deal progressing to the point where he needed to pledge our assets as collateral. He certainly hadn't discussed asking for my consent to risk our home and savings on his business venture. More importantly, he was proceeding as if I had no financial interests or business activities that might be affected by pledging our jointly held assets. The letter made no mention of considering my own business operations or asking whether risking our financial security might impact my company's ability to meet its obligations. I called Caroline immediately. "I need legal advice," I said as soon as she answered. "Marcus is trying to use our house and joint accounts as collateral for a business deal, and he never discussed it with me. Can you come to my office now? Bring the letter and any other documents you have about this deal." An hour later, I was sitting in Caroline's law office, watching her review the letter and the Pinnacle Holdings materials I'd copied from Marcus's computer months earlier. "This is problematic on several levels," she said, making notes as she read. "First, he can't pledge marital assets without your consent, which means he's required to discuss this with you. Second, if you refuse consent, he'd need to find alternative collateral or risk losing the deal. Third, given your business operations, you have legitimate reasons to refuse consent that have nothing to do with spite or obstruction." "What kind of reasons?" "Your business requires operational stability and access to credit facilities. If your personal assets are pledged as collateral for his deal and something goes wrong, it could affect your company's creditworthiness and your ability to meet obligations to clients and employees." The irony was perfect. Marcus had spent months assuming I had no business interests worth considering, while I'd been building a company that was now substantial enough to provide legitimate grounds for refusing to support his business ventures. "What are my options?" "You can consent, refuse consent, or negotiate modified terms that protect your interests while allowing his deal to proceed. Given what you've told me about your relationship and your business growth, I'd recommend the third option." "What would modified terms look like?" "Partial collateral that doesn't include assets essential to your business operations, personal guarantees limited to specific amounts rather than unlimited liability, and contractual protections that prioritize your business obligations if asset liquidation becomes necessary." We spent the next hour drafting a response that would demonstrate my sophistication about business law while revealing the existence of financial interests Marcus didn't know about. The letter would request a meeting to discuss the collateral requirements and propose alternative arrangements that protected both his deal and my company's operational needs. "This is going to surprise him," Caroline observed as she reviewed our draft. "Good. It's time he learned that I have business interests that are just as important as his." That evening, I arrived home to find Marcus in his office, surrounded by documents related to the Pinnacle Holdings deal. He looked up as I entered, his expression expectant. "I got a letter from your attorneys today," I said, handing him our response. He scanned it quickly, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching alarm. "Elena, what is this?" he asked, holding up the letter. "You're talking about business operations and credit facilities and operational stability." "What business operations?" For the first time in our marriage, I had information he wanted and didn't have. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for 3 years was reversing in real time. "The consulting business has grown significantly," I replied. "I now have employees, international operations, and financial obligations that could be affected if our personal assets are pledged as collateral for your deals." "Employees? International operations?" His voice rose slightly. "Elena, how could you have employees and international operations without discussing it with me?" The question was so audacious that I almost laughed. He'd been planning a $50 million deal for months without mentioning it to me, but he was outraged that I'd hired staff without his permission. "The same way you could plan a major development project without discussing it with me," I replied calmly. "Business decisions that don't affect our marriage directly don't require spousal consultation. but this affects our marriage very directly. You're talking about refusing consent for collateral arrangements that could cost me the biggest deal of my career. I'm talking about negotiating terms that protect both our interests instead of sacrificing mine for yours. Marcus stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. Elena, I need those collateral arrangements to close this deal. Pinnacle Holdings requires specific guarantees, and our assets are exactly what they're looking for. Then we'll find a way to structure the guarantees that protects my business operations while supporting your deal. Your business operations? He said the phrase as if it were inherently ridiculous. Elena, how significant could your consulting work possibly be? We're talking about a $50 million development project. I pulled out my phone and showed him the quarterly revenue projections for Elena Martinez International. His eyes widened as he processed the numbers. This can't be right, he said. These numbers suggest you're generating significant monthly revenue. From consulting? From sustainable sourcing services for fashion companies, including a major partnership with Sustainable Style Collective that's expanding faster than we initially projected. Marcus set down the phone and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been respect. Elena, if these numbers are accurate, you're operating a legitimate business. A successful business. Yes, Marcus, I am. But how? When? I mean, you never mentioned anything this substantial. You never asked about anything substantial. You asked about my little consulting work and my hobby projects. And you seemed satisfied with minimal answers. He was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what I'd revealed. Why didn't you tell me? He finally asked. Because you made it clear that you didn't think I was capable of building anything significant. Because every time I tried to discuss business concepts or expansion plans, you redirected me towards smaller, safer projects. Because you convinced me that real business was too complicated for me to understand. Elena, I was trying to protect you from disappointment. Business can be brutal, especially for people who haven't been exposed to that world. The world I've been successfully operating in for over a year while you convinced yourself I was playing at entrepreneurship? Marcus ran his hands through his hair, clearly struggling to reconcile his image of me with the evidence I'd presented. I don't understand how this happened, he said. How did you learn about international operations and credit facilities and all these technical aspects? The same way you learned about real estate development. Research, experience, making mistakes and learning from them. Working with people who had expertise I needed to acquire. But I have an MBA. I have years of experience in complex business transactions. And I have a year of experience building something from nothing, solving problems you never taught me to solve, developing capabilities you never thought I could develop. The conversation continued for another hour, Marcus asking increasingly detailed questions about my operations, while I demonstrated knowledge of business concepts he'd convinced himself I couldn't understand. With each answer, I watched his perception of me shift from protective husband to something approaching professional colleague. Elena, he said finally, I owe you an apology. I underestimated your capabilities significantly. Yes, you did. But this changes everything about the collateral situation. If your business is generating the kind of revenue these projections suggest, then you have legitimate concerns about pledging our joint assets. Exactly. Which is why I want to negotiate terms that protect both our interests. What did you have in mind? I outlined the modified collateral arrangement that Caroline and I had developed, which would provide Pinnacle Holdings with sufficient guarantees, while protecting the assets most critical to my business operations. This could work, Marcus said, reviewing my proposal. It's more complex than what they initially requested, but it addresses their security concerns while protecting your operational needs. Good. Then we can move forward in a way that supports both our businesses. Marcus looked at me with an expression that was part admiration, part bewilderment. I can't believe you built all this without me knowing about it. I can't believe you thought I was incapable of building it. That night, I lay awake thinking about the strange conversation with Marcus, how his attitude toward me had shifted so dramatically once he understood the scope of what I'd accomplished. For months, I'd been building independence from his judgment and validation. Now that he was finally recognizing my competence, I realized I no longer needed his recognition. The woman who'd started consulting to prove her husband wrong had evolved into someone who no longer defined success through his opinions. My business had become self-sustaining, professionally satisfying, and financially rewarding, entirely independent of his approval. But his reaction revealed something important about our relationship that I'd been avoiding. Marcus hadn't been consciously malicious in his undermining of my confidence. He'd genuinely believed that I needed protection from my own ambitions, because he'd fundamentally misunderstood my capabilities. The misunderstanding had been so complete that he'd convinced himself he was being loving and supportive, while systematically discouraging me from pursuing goals I was entirely capable of achieving. Now that he understood what I'd built, he was proud of me in the same patronizing way he'd always been proud of my charity work or social accomplishments. The difference was that I no longer needed his pride to validate my achievements. The next morning brought a call from David Chen at Apex Ventures, confirming his visit to Seattle for the following week to discuss their investment proposal. I scheduled the meeting for Tuesday, giving me time to prepare comprehensive materials about our operations, growth strategy, and capital needs. "Elena, this is exciting," Jessica said when I told her about the private equity interest. "Investment from Apex would give us access to resources and connections that could accelerate our growth beyond anything we've planned. It would also mean sharing ownership and decision-making authority," I replied. "That's a significant change from controlling everything ourselves. But the right partners could help us scale faster and more efficiently than we could manage independently." Jessica was right, but the decision represented more than just strategic planning. Accepting private equity investment would mean acknowledging that Elena Martinez International had grown beyond what I could manage alone, that the business I'd started to prove my independence had become substantial enough to attract sophisticated institutional investors. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus was finally recognizing my business acumen, just as I was considering partnerships that would validate my success at the highest levels of the business community. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia Reeves. "Victoria wants to discuss expanding our partnership beyond sourcing. Can we schedule a call this week?" Expanding beyond sourcing suggested opportunities I hadn't anticipated, potentially moving Elena Martinez International into new areas of sustainable fashion business. Each conversation seemed to reveal new possibilities that were larger and more complex than anything I'd originally envisioned. That afternoon, I walked through my office building, observing the 12 employees who now depended on the company for their livelihoods, the operations that served dozens of clients across multiple countries, the systems and processes that had evolved to manage complexity I'd never imagined when I started. The woman who'd begun consulting to demonstrate basic competence had built something that required sophisticated strategic thinking, operational expertise, and leadership capabilities she'd discovered she possessed. Marcus had wanted to keep me small and manageable, convinced that my dependence on him was necessary for our marriage's stability. Instead, his systematic undermining had taught me to be completely self-reliant, strategically independent, and professionally successful beyond anything he'd thought to prepare for. Tomorrow, I'd wake up as the CEO of a rapidly growing company, considering private equity investment and international expansion opportunities that could reshape my entire industry. Tonight, I'd go home to a husband who was finally beginning to understand that the woman he'd married was far more capable than either of them had realized. But understanding my capabilities and accepting my independence were two very different things, and I suspected the real test of our relationship was just beginning. The boardroom at Apex Ventures' Seattle office commanded a panoramic view of Elliott Bay, the kind of space where decisions worth millions of dollars were made with handshakes and signed with fountain pens. David Chen sat at the head of the polished conference table, flanked by two associates whose laptops displayed financial models that would determine the future trajectory of Elena Martinez International. "Elena, thank you for hosting this meeting," David began, his tone carrying the weight of someone accustomed to dealing with substantial sums. "After reviewing your operations and growth projections, we're prepared to make a formal investment offer." I settled into the leather chair across from him, flanked by my own team, my attorney, accountant, and Jessica, who'd evolved from logistics coordinator to operations director as the company expanded. The symmetry felt appropriate. 18 months ago, I'd been a woman whose husband thought she couldn't understand basic business concepts. Today, I was negotiating with institutional investors as an equal. "We're interested in hearing your proposal," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the magnitude of what was about to unfold. David opened a leather portfolio and slid a term sheet across the table. $25 million investment for a 30% equity stake, structured as preferred shares with liquidation preferences and anti-dilution protections. $25 million. The number represented more money than I'd ever imagined having access to. Enough capital to transform Elena Martinez International from a successful regional business into a major player in sustainable fashion globally. The valuation reflects our assessment of your current operations and growth potential, one of David's associates explained. Based on your revenue trajectory and market position, we believe this business could reach 9-figure annual revenues within 5 years. 9-figure revenues. The phrase hung in the air like a challenge and a promise simultaneously. I'd started this business to prove I could succeed independently. Now sophisticated investors were projecting success beyond anything I'd dared to envision. What level of operational control would you expect? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Board representation proportional to our ownership stake, quarterly reporting requirements, and approval rights for major strategic decisions, David replied. But day-to-day operations would remain under your management. We invest in leadership teams, not just business models. The terms were more favorable than I'd expected, reflecting their confidence in my ability to execute on growth opportunities. More importantly, the structure preserved my role as the primary decision-maker, while providing access to resources and expertise that could accelerate expansion dramatically. I'll need time to review this with my team, I said, though every instinct told me the offer was fair and the partnership could be transformative. Of course. This is exactly the kind of thoughtful approach that made us want to work with you. After the Apex team left, I sat alone in the conference room looking at the term sheet, processing what accepting their investment would mean. Elena Martinez International would become a substantial business with institutional backing, professional governance structures, and growth targets that would require capabilities I was still developing. But more than the business implications, accepting the investment would represent the final step in a transformation that had begun with overhearing Marcus dismiss my potential. The woman he'd called helpless and dependent was about to become the CEO of a company worth more than his entire real estate portfolio. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Marcus's number. "Elena, we need to talk," he said without preamble, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't identify. "Can you come home now?" "What's wrong?" "Just come home, please." The drive to our penthouse gave me time to consider what might have prompted his urgent request. Perhaps Pinnacle Holdings had accelerated their timeline, or maybe he'd discovered additional details about my business operations that he wanted to discuss. I found Marcus in his office, but instead of the usual confidence and control that characterized his professional demeanor, he looked defeated. Papers were scattered across his desk, and his normally perfect appearance was disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been running his hands through his hair repeatedly. "Jonathan called this morning," he said without looking up from the documents. "Pinnacle Holdings is withdrawing from the Bellevue project." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because I cared about his business success, but because I recognized the devastation in his voice. Whatever had happened with Pinnacle Holdings represented more than just a lost opportunity. What happened? Market conditions, he said. Interest rate changes making the financing less attractive. Political complications with zoning approvals. Basically, they're backing out because the risk-reward ratio no longer meets their investment criteria. Marcus finally looked up, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Genuine vulnerability, perhaps even fear. "Elena, I've been leveraging our assets for months in preparation for this deal. Bridge loans, credit lines, equipment purchases. I was so confident about Pinnacle Holdings that I committed resources I don't actually have." The full implications of what he was saying began to crystallize. How leveraged? Everything. The house, our investment accounts, my business credit lines. I pledged it all as collateral because I knew this deal would pay off everything and generate enough profit to set us up for life. I sat down slowly, processing the magnitude of his financial overextension. "Marcus, what does this mean practically?" "It means I have 90 days to repay loans I can't cover, or we lose everything. The house, the cars, the investment accounts. Everything except what the prenup protects, which is basically nothing significant. The irony was so complete it was almost absurd. Marcus had spent years convincing me that I was financially helpless and would never survive without his protection. Now he was revealing that his financial management had created a crisis that could destroy everything we'd built together. "Why didn't you discuss this with me before committing our assets?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "Because I was protecting you from complexity you didn't need to worry about. Because I thought I understood business better than you ever could. Because I was arrogant enough to believe I could handle everything without involving you in decisions that affected both our futures." The admission hung between us like a confession, acknowledging not just his financial miscalculation, but the fundamental disrespect that had characterized our relationship for years. "What do you need from me?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Elena, your business is generating substantial revenue. If you could help cover some of these obligations temporarily, just until I can restructure or find alternative financing." He was asking me to use my success to rescue him from the consequences of decisions he'd made without consulting me, using assets he'd pledged without my knowledge, for a deal he'd hidden from me because he decided I was too limited to understand it. How much are we talking about? $3 million immediately to prevent default on the most critical loans. Maybe another $2 million over the next 6 months to buy time for restructuring. $5 million. The amount that would save Marcus from financial ruin happened to be exactly the kind of capital that Elena Martinez International could access through the Apex Ventures investment if I chose to accept their offer. "Marcus, I need to understand something. If our situations were reversed, if I had made financial commitments that risked everything we owned without discussing it with you, what would you expect me to do?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I would expect you to take responsibility for your decisions and find a way to fix the problem without destroying our security." "And if I asked you to risk your business success to cover my mistakes?" Another long silence. "I would expect you to understand that I had my own obligations and couldn't sacrifice everything I'd built to compensate for your poor judgment." The honesty was brutal and clarifying. Marcus was asking me to do exactly what he would never consider doing for me, because he still fundamentally believed that his financial needs took priority over mine. "I can help you," I said finally, "but not the way you're thinking." Hope flickered in his expression. "What do you mean?" I can provide you with enough capital to prevent immediate default and buy time for restructuring. But it won't be a gift or a loan from your wife. It will be a business transaction between Elena Martinez International and Marcus Hernandez Properties, with terms that protect my company's interests." "Elena, I don't understand. What kind of business transaction?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the Apex Ventures term sheet. "I'm about to accept a $25 million investment that will give me access to exactly the kind of capital you need. But accessing that capital for purposes other than business expansion requires board approval and contractual justification." Marcus scanned the document, his eyes widening as he processed the valuation and investment terms. "Elena, this is extraordinary. This makes your business worth more than my entire real estate portfolio." "Yes, it does. But how is this a business transaction rather than helping your husband?" "Because Elena Martinez International will acquire a controlling interest in Marcus Hernandez Properties in exchange for the capital infusion. You'll maintain operational control, but major decisions will require approval from EMI's board of directors." The proposal was elegant in its symmetry. Marcus would get the capital he needed to avoid financial ruin, while Elena Martinez International would acquire a real estate portfolio that complemented our fashion industry focus. More importantly, the structure would reverse the power dynamic that had defined our relationship for years. "You're talking about acquiring my business?" "I'm talking about saving your business while protecting mine. The alternative is letting you default on obligations that could affect our joint assets, which would impact my company's operational stability." Marcus stared at the term sheet for several minutes, clearly struggling with the implications of what I was proposing. His wife, whom he'd spent years convincing was financially helpless, was offering to rescue him from bankruptcy by acquiring his business through her own company. "What would this mean for our marriage?" he asked finally. "That depends on whether you can accept being married to someone whose business success exceeds your own." Elena, I've been wrong about your capabilities. I can see that now, but this feels like punishment for underestimating you. It's not punishment, Marcus. It's consequences. You made financial decisions without consulting me because you thought I was too limited to understand them. Now those decisions have created a crisis that requires my business resources to resolve. The price of my help is acknowledging that I'm capable of making strategic decisions about how that help is structured. And if I refuse, then you find another way to cover $5 million in obligations within 90 days, and I focus on growing my business independently. The choice was stark and fair. Marcus could accept help on terms that reflected my actual capabilities, or he could maintain his pride and face bankruptcy alone. I need time to think about this, he said. You have 24 hours. After that, I'm accepting the Apex investment and allocating the capital for business expansion rather than rescue operations. That evening, I called Caroline to discuss the legal implications of acquiring Marcus's business through Elena Martinez International. This is brilliant, she said after I explained the proposed structure. You're using your success to solve his crisis while protecting yourself from his poor judgment. It's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that separates successful entrepreneurs from people who just have good intentions. It feels strange to be in a position to rescue him after years of being told I needed his protection. Strange, but appropriate. You've built something significant through your own competence, and now you're using that success to make strategic decisions about your combined future. That's not revenge, that's leadership. The next morning, Marcus appeared in my office at Elena Martinez International, looking around the space with an expression of amazement. He'd never visited my workplace before, never seen the conference rooms where I negotiated million-dollar contracts or the operations center where my team managed international supply chains. Elena, this is impressive, he said, observing the organized activity of a successful business. I had no idea the scale of what you'd built. Because you never asked to see it. I know, I was wrong about that, and I was wrong about your capabilities. I'm here to accept your offer. The acquisition terms? All of it. EMI acquires controlling interest in my business. I maintain operational control, subject to board approval, and we restructure our personal relationship to reflect the reality of what you've accomplished. What does restructuring our personal relationship mean to you? Marcus was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with concepts that challenged everything he'd believed about our marriage. It means accepting that you're not just my wife who happens to have a successful business. It means acknowledging that you're a business leader whose judgment and strategic thinking are at least equal to mine. It means treating you as a partner rather than someone who needs my guidance and protection. And you can live with that? Elena, the alternative is losing everything I've worked for because I was too proud to accept help from someone whose success I didn't understand. Pride is expensive, and I can't afford it anymore. 2 weeks later, I stood before the Apex Ventures board to present the modified investment proposal that included the acquisition of Marcus Hernandez properties. David Chen reviewed the integrated business plan with obvious approval. This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we hope to see, he said. Acquiring complementary real estate assets positions EMI for vertical integration opportunities we hadn't anticipated. The combined valuation actually justifies a larger investment if you're interested. Larger investment. The phrase that would have terrified me 18 months ago now felt like validation of strategic decisions I'd made independently. What are you thinking? $35 million for the same equity stake, reflecting the expanded asset base and growth potential of the integrated operations. $35 million. Enough capital to transform Elena Martinez International into a major player in sustainable fashion and real estate, with operations that could influence entire markets rather than just participating in them. That evening, I stood on the terrace of our penthouse, looking out at the Seattle skyline and remembering the night when Marcus's words had shattered my world. He'd wanted a wife who would never survive without him, someone whose dependence guaranteed his importance in her life. Instead, his systematic undermining had created someone completely self-reliant, professionally successful, and strategically independent. The woman he'd tried to keep small had grown beyond anything he'd thought to prepare for. Marcus joined me on the terrace, carrying 2 glasses of wine. "I have something for you," he said, handing me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, several pages of Marcus's careful script. "Elena," it began, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you acknowledgement of what you've accomplished, despite my efforts to convince you it was impossible. I owe you recognition of capabilities I was too blind to see. Most importantly, I owe you the respect I should have shown from the beginning." The letter continued for several pages, detailing his recognition of how he'd undermined my confidence, discouraged my ambitions, and convinced me to accept limitations that had never been real. It was comprehensive, honest, and devastatingly accurate. "The woman I married was extraordinary," the letter concluded. "The woman you've become is beyond anything I had the vision to imagine. I hope we can build a future that honors what you've achieved, rather than limiting what you might accomplish." I looked up to find Marcus watching me with an expression of genuine humility. "It's a start," I said. "Elena, I know I have no right to ask this, but is there a chance we can rebuild our marriage on terms that reflect who you really are, rather than who I thought you should be?" I considered the question, thinking about the journey from dismissed wife to successful CEO, from someone who asked permission for her dreams, to someone who created opportunities beyond what anyone had imagined possible. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "The woman you married doesn't exist anymore. She was replaced by someone stronger, more independent, more confident about her own judgment. If you can love that woman as much as you loved controlling the other one, maybe we can find a way forward. I want to try, then we'll try. But on equal terms, with equal respect, and with the understanding that my success belongs to me regardless of what happens between us." 6 months later, Elena Martinez International had grown into a company with operations across 3 countries, serving major retailers throughout North America, and generating revenues that placed it among the top sustainable fashion service providers globally. The integration with Marcus Hernandez Properties had created synergies that neither business could have achieved independently. More importantly, I discovered that the satisfaction of building something meaningful far exceeded the satisfaction of proving someone wrong. The business had evolved beyond a response to Marcus's limitations into something that created value for clients, opportunities for employees, and positive change in an industry desperately needing sustainable alternatives. My office wall now displayed magazine covers, featuring stories about women entrepreneurs who'd built successful businesses despite starting with limited resources. I'd become one of the success stories that inspired other women to pursue ambitions they'd been told were unrealistic. The woman Marcus had said would never survive without him had built something that would thrive with or without anyone's approval. His prediction had become the foundation for proving him spectacularly wrong, but more importantly, it had become the catalyst for discovering capabilities I'd never known I possessed. The business empire I'd built hadn't just proved him wrong, it had proved me right about everything I'd been too afraid to believe about myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.